Well, good morning, everyone. Happy Tuesday morning, and welcome back to Morning Musings. Hope you had a fantastic Memorial Day weekend. A little bit of a break, and it's always a pretty good thing. I managed to get the heads off of a 1966 Mustang I'm working on, having to put head gaskets on it, and whew, boy, that was a challenge. I hadn't put head gaskets. I hadn't taken heads off of an old motor in the car in a long time. And what's that was saying? My body doth protest. Yeah, kind of sore over that, but nonetheless, hopefully I'll get that car running. Beautiful, beautiful car, and get that running before long and be able to sell it. So, anyway, again, thanks for joining me. We are continuing our study of the feast days of Israel. We are approaching our study at the present time, and we will expand it into other areas, of course, as we continue. Now, I gave you fair warning when I very first started, though, that I was not going to turn this into a 2 or 3 or 4 year study. It is a vast, comprehensive study. I know, undoubtedly, I'm going to leave some stuff out that some of you who are very, very sharp on the feast days. I've corresponded with some of you. Some of you have sent me some really marvelous private messages, emails, and what have you, sharing your thoughts, insights, and knowledge of the feast days. And I appreciate that. I really honestly do. I still consider myself almost a neophyte when it comes to the feast days, although I really enjoy studying it. So again, I know that I'm not going to be presenting what can be called a comprehensive study of the feast days. I'm wanting to hit the areas, the subjects, the elements of the feast days that are particularly significant in regard to their typology, as that relates then to eschatology. And as a result of that focus, what we're doing is we're focusing on the fact that the final 3 feast days of Israel, what is known as Rosh Hashanah, the Feast of Trumpets, Yom Kippur, the Feast of the Atonement, and Sukkot, the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of Harvest, the Feast of Our Joy, the Feast of the Nations, and on and on. They're all the same. That last few names all are associated with the Feast of Ingathering, the Feast of Harvest. And by the way, I cover this in this particular book. I share with you so many of the names that are associated with the different feast days. It's absolutely fascinating to see all the descriptors that are linked with the final 3 feast days especially. It's really, really fascinating. Okay. Well, I've spent some time establishing that Yom Teruah, the Feast of Trumpets, according to Paul in Colossians chapter 2, 16 and 17, he told the Gentile Christians who were being pressured by the Judaizers to keep the feast days, to obey the law. And so the law of Moses. And so Paul wrote addressing those Gentile Christians. And he said to them, "Let no man judge you in respect of new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which are," present tense when Paul wrote, "shadows of the good things about to come." Now, I have shared with you how incredibly significant this passage is. Historically, in the Sabbatarian world, and somebody just chided me just the other day. They said, "Well, you keep talking about the Sabbatarians as the ones who say, well, what Paul was teaching here is that the ceremonial feast days were taken out of the way, but not the Sabbath." In reality, there are others besides Sabbatarians who understand that Paul was saying that the ceremonial feast days were taken out of the way. That wasn't my point. I will understand that men, even such as G.K. Beale, take note of the fact or make the claim that Paul was saying the feast days, the quote ceremonial laws, was removed. Now, here's what's interesting, however. Once again, my point was not simply to say, and my point was absolutely not to say, oh, well, the only people in the world who believe that Paul was talking about the ceremonial feast days were Sabbatarians. That's a misunderstanding of what I said. And if I did not communicate properly in that regard, then I apologize about that. My point was the Sabbatarian world has historically appealed to Colossians 2:16-17 to make the following argument. Paul said the new moons, feast days, and Sabbaths, which are all ceremonial feast days, inclusive of animal sacrifices, etc., Paul is saying that God, through Christ, nailed those things to the cross. He removed all of the ceremonial, bloody, sacrificial feast days, but he left the Sabbath intact. Point number one, that's not what he says. As a matter of fact, if you're going to use the word Sabbaths, and he uses the plural form, the comprehensive form, Sabbaton, to say don't let anybody judge you in respect of Sabbaths, plural. So Paul was making the argument not to be judged by any Sabbath, observance or non-observance of any Sabbath. You cannot limit Sabbaton to 6 feast days, or to 6 Sabbaths, or to 5 or to 4, and say, oh, well, yeah, but we're still to be judged in regard to one. Sorry, that's a violation of the text. Secondly, Paul emphatically does not say, I know this is somewhat repetitious, but it's crucial that you catch the power of this argument. Paul did not say that God nailed the ceremonial feast days to the cross. If Christ had nailed the ceremonial feast days to the cross, then Paul was obviously pretty confused when he said that they were, when he wrote in 62 AD, they are a shadow of the good things. Now, first of all, remember this present active tense in the Greek. When Paul wrote, they were, present tense, shadows, and they were shadows of the good things that had not yet come. They were shadows of the things, however, of those things which were about to come. Now, folks, let's be very clear here. Jesus said, not one jot, not one tittle of the law. He did not qualify what part of the law. He did not say, well, not one jot, not one tittle of the Decalogue will pass until it's all fulfilled. He did not say, not one jot, not one tittle of the ceremonial laws will pass until it is all fulfilled. Now, if he had said that, it would present even more problems for those who argue that Paul was saying those ceremonial laws were nailed to the cross, because that's not what Paul said. So my point here is, you simply cannot argue that Paul was teaching that the, quote, ceremonial feast days, including the bloody sacrifices, was nailed to the cross. And look, I am more than aware. I've been studying this issue since I was sophomore in high school, really. I'm more than aware of the arguments about this. This is crucial. This is foundational, historically so, to the Sabbatarian view in their delineation between ceremonial versus non-ceremonial. They suggest, they teach, at least they always have taught. Paul was teaching that the ceremonial feast days were nailed to the cross. We don't have to observe them anymore, but we still have to observe the 7-day Sabbath. That is not what the text says. And it's interesting to me, and I say this with all due respect, it is interesting to me that amongst all of the Sabbatarians, and you know I'm not using that term in any way disrespectfully at all whatsoever. To use the term Sabbatarian is just simply referring to those people, good, sincere people, who observe the seventh-day Sabbath. Nothing derogatory about the term. Certainly nothing intended by me. But not one single Sabbatarian, not one, at least that I remember, has challenged what I have said about Paul's use of the present tenses and about his use of even the future tense in regard to those things about to come. They've argued about, oh, well, look how beautiful and glorious the Sabbath is. And God would never take away that which he established in holiness and spirituality. Well, that's another issue that we'll discuss later, perhaps. But the point of fact is, no one has addressed the central issue that I am making about Colossians 2:16 and 17, emphasizing that Paul did not say the ceremonial feast days had been nailed to the cross. It's simply not what he said. So the question is, when Paul said that those, quote, ceremonial feast days, I don't even like to use that term, to be honest about it, all of the Sabbaths were on equal footing with one another. If you violated any of them, you could be killed. Particularly the atonement, for instance, Leviticus chapter 23. So, you can't, there's just simply no textual justification in delineating between the Sabbaths. Not according to Leviticus chapter 23. All right? So, Paul said that the Sabbaths, plural, comprehensively, when he wrote in 62 AD, were shadows of the good things about to come. So the question is, what did the Sabbaths represent? One of those Sabbaths, which is what we want to focus on today as introductory comments here, but in our examination of the last three feast days, we want to turn our attention now to the atonement, Yom Kippur. Israel called Yom Kippur the most important feast in Israel's existence. Doesn't that signify, let me ask you this question. If Yom Kippur was the most important feast day in Israel's existence, then why wasn't the Sabbath of Yom Kippur likewise not one of the most important Sabbaths in Israel's festal calendar? This is indicated by the fact that in Leviticus chapter 23, anyone not observing Yom Kippur Sabbath was to be put to death. You know, just like the seventh day Sabbath. 6 days you shall work, seventh day. On the seventh day you shall do no labor whatsoever. If any man works on the Sabbath day, he's to be put to death. Exodus chapter 20. So, we have here in Yom Kippur the very crown jewel, if you please, of Israel's festal calendar. It was a Sabbath. It was a Sabbath of ultimate importance. So the question is, what did Yom Kippur foreshadow? What did it prophesy? What did it anticipate? Because Paul said that the Sabbaths, when he wrote, were types and shadows of the good things that were about to come. So, in this short week, this is an introductory examination of Yom Kippur. Tomorrow, on Wednesday, again being a short week, we will begin an examination of what the book of Hebrews, particularly chapter 9, indicates that Yom Kippur foreshadowed. I'll see you on the flip side.